Now, Mr. Taylor, I'm going to invite you to take the oath in a moment or two, just to remind you that you're talking not just to those you see in front of you and those to your left and to me, but also to a much wider audience, which will number probably over 200 around the country. By the country, I mean the whole of the UK. Mary.
Please state your full name.
Simon Howard Taylor.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Mr. Taylor, just before we start, I understand you have your statement in front of you and some notes that you may want to use to refresh your memory from.
That's correct.
Is there a particular time period when you think your memory might be particularly limited?
What, historically?
Yes.
Yes, my memory during the sort of 90s in particular, from sort of the early 90s through to about 98, 99, at that point, I had HIV, and as a consequence of my HIV infection, my memory is somewhat impaired of that period, but not totally.
You have, before we get on to your roles in the Hemophilia Society, just to set the context, you yourself have severe haemophilia A.
Correct.
And you've been co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C.
Correct.
As a result of blood products.
Yes.
You were a member of the Haemophilia Society for a number of years before you were co-opted onto the executive committee in 1985. Is that right?
Well, I hadn't really taken a very active role in the society before then. I, to some extent, got on with my life. And it was when HIV clearly became a threat, and I realised that I would probably be very personally impacted. I sort of came forward to the society because I had an experience in communications, public relations, lobbying, that kind of thing, effectively to offer my services. So 1985, when I got involved, that was the first time I was really had contact and involvement with the society.
But before the co-option, were you a member of the society?
Yes, I probably was, yes.
And were you receiving publications from the Bulletin and things like that?
Probably, but I don't really recall.
You were co-opted in 85 and then elected onto the executive committee in 1986.
Correct.
And you served then until 1988.
That's right.
And then you served again between 1991 and 1996.
That's correct.
And then again between 1998 and 2002.
That's right.
And in that final period, you were vice chair and treasurer during that time.
The final period I was treasurer. I was vice chair in the period up to between about 1994 to 96, but for the period between 98 and 2002, for the whole of that period, I was the treasurer.
You were also a trustee of the Macfarlane Trust.
Yes. Between
1988 and 1990.
That's correct.
And all of that was voluntary.
Yes.
And alongside that, you were working full-time, as you say, in public relations, communications.
I was working very much full-time in major public relations agencies where I had a senior role up until 1992, when, because of increasing ill health, I stopped work and I then became freelance.
I'd like to start with when you were a member of the society, before you were co-opted. And you say in your statement that your perception of the society at that time was that it was focused on providing information and support to the haemophilia community.
That's
that right?
Correct, yes.
Can you tell us what kind of information you received from the society in that early 80s, late 70s, early 80s time?
To be honest, I very little. As I say, I'm not sure that my funnily enough, my mother was a member from the earliest days, and she would actually get the documents, and I would quite often then read them. But I don't recall that I was receiving regular documents much before that.
The inquiry's heard evidence about the Hemofact leaflets that were produced. Do you recall either you receiving them or hearing about them from your mother?
Yes, but not in a major way. I wouldn't say they were a major source of information to me. The major sources of information to me were what I was reading in the press more than anything else at that point before I became a trustee.
In your statement, you've said that many people with haemophilia were isolated and that often GPs, dentists and other health professionals were frequently unequipped and often unwilling to provide appropriate help and support. And some people with haemophilia were treated by well-meaning but inexpert haematology consultants with very small cohorts of haemophilia patients.
That's correct.
And you say that the society played a crucial role in addressing some of those problems.
That's right, yes.
Was that in part by providing information to patients so that they knew what treatment they could expect and perhaps what the risks of treatment were?
Absolutely. So one of the core functions of the society at that time, and I would probably consider even to this day, was to enable and empower people with haemophilia so that they could know what to expect from their medical and clinical professionals, and also to provide help and support if they weren't getting it. So one of the things that the society did was to sometimes intervene on behalf of patients, as it were, to help them if they had a difficulty with a GP or a dentist or something like that.
So in terms of the information that was being provided by the society to their members, what was your sense of how much people were relying on that information? What weight they were putting on that information?
I would think not a lot is the short answer. It would be informative, but the primary relationship was always with the treating physician. And because of the nature of haemophilia, I believe that people with haemophilia tended to have very close relationships with their centre director and their haemophilia centre. And whilst it was information, I'm not sure or not convinced that people necessarily relied on it. But it was to inform a conversation that they would then have with their doctor.
So there was no sense at all of the society trying to replace the role of the doctor in providing advice?
Absolutely not. We were all lay individuals. We had, for the most part, no scientific or medical training.
But as a matter of fact, would it be fair to suggest that patients may have relied on the information to some degree?
Yes. Obviously one can't speak for other individuals.
But that was your sense, both as a member and in that early period
Yes.
of joining the committee?
Yes.
Could we have the document HCDO 40276_033, please? We can see this is the annual report of 1986, and if we can turn to page 7, please, Shumik. And the second paragraph down, we can see that there's discussion of AIDS being the dominant theme of the last annual report, and reference in this paragraph to the attention given to AIDS by national newspapers. Then in the last sentence of that paragraph, it says, a main responsibility of the society has been in seeing that errors of fact are corrected and accurate information made available speedily to our members. Would it be fair to say that in 1986, the society was seeking to be an authoritative voice on AIDS and haemophilia to both the members of the society and the wider public?
Yes, I think that would be fair. As the article points out, it was a time of alarmist media coverage, and we would send things out, to try and explain, to reassure people that they couldn't pick up AIDS or HIV from sitting in a chair, for example, with somebody else, and those kinds of things. Because there were actually also, I think it might be helpful, there were very few others at that stage. The Terence Higgins Trust, National AIDS Trust, those were very nascent at that point.
And so there was a sense of the society needing to fill a gap.
Yes.
Could we then move forward to 1991? WITN 45402. And we pick up the 1991 bulletin, the fourth bulletin in 1991, talking about the essentials of haemophilia care and the launch of the new blueprint. The article starts by discussing the NHS reforms, providing an opportunity to set out a detailed standard for the care of all people with haemophilia in the UK. And we can read on, and it says, this care is normally provided at present by hospitals in health districts outside that where the individual lives. So it's been necessary to explain to district health authorities what they should be buying and where that care should be provided. And then the next column, the Society's document, The Essentials of Haemophilia Care, has been produced in order to assist DHAs in their new task. The paper goes on to give guidance on how DHAs should go about, and it's the next column, contracting for these services. So again, would it be fair to suggest that the Society in this example was seeking to be an authoritative voice in relation to haemophilia care and to educate district health authorities on what the Society believed to be the best treatment options?
Yes, that would have been produced in conjunction with the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation, who of course were the medical and clinical specialists. But the objective was to, as you say, make sure that district health authorities knew what they should be doing from a commissioning point of view, and also, again, what patients should be able to expect from their treating physicians.
And in your experience of being on the executive committee, the trustee board as it became later, was that something that carried on throughout your time of seeking to be an authoritative voice both for the members and for health bodies and for society generally?
Yes, one of our, as a health charity, one of our key roles was to advocate on behalf of our community in order to achieve the best possible standards of care, the latest forms of treatment, those kinds of things. And sometimes, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, that came into conflict over cost issues and things like that.
In terms of the mechanics of producing publications for members, so the bulletin that we've just looked at and the Haemofacts that we've spoken of, we've heard in other evidence that the executive committee had very little involvement in what was put in them. Is that your recollection as well?
It varied considerably. So it might well be that a small group of the executive assisted with drafting elements of it, but they would also work very closely with specific clinicians. So if a document had a specific remit, then we would turn to clinicians who are expert in that particular area for advice. But ultimately then the editor of the Bulletin would work with the David Waters and the chairman probably in the final copy, as it were.
Could we have HSOC 0019583, please? we have here a bulletin from 1988, and it's the very first article, thanks being recorded for Clive Knight's lengthy time as editor of the Bulletin and other publications. In the second to last paragraph, we see that it's noted that he's continuing to serve on the Publications and External Relations Working Party, so his experience and expertise will not be lost. Were you also on that committee, that working party?
Quite possibly. I don't recall directly, but it is quite possible, yes.
And can you tell us anything of what involvement that working party had in the production of the Bulletin or other publications?
I don't recall specifically. Again, we might have acted as sort of sub-editors or contribute individual articles, but I don't recall particularly.
Is it right then that the editor, the chairman, and the coordinator were primarily deciding what articles would be produced, but there might have been some assistance from some executive committee members?
I think that's right. I think the editor would have done most of the heavy lifting, as it were, in terms of writing it. But suggestions for articles would have come from other executive members, from local groups, individual members even would have contributed articles or made suggestions as to content, as it were.
And when that content was clinical,
Yes.
You said it would have come from a clinician.
Well, again, it varied enormously. So sometimes it would have come directly from a clinician, and there are many examples in the evidence of articles by clinicians. If it was a more general article, it might then be written by somebody else on the executive committee and then run by a clinician to be checked.
If an article was originally written by a clinician, was there any checking of it by another clinician or any form of double checking it?
No, not that I can recall. Again, sometimes there would be a sort of consensus view. You know, if it was a particularly important piece, a number of clinicians might be asked for their input and contribution.
And how would one know that from something one was reading in the bulletin?
Probably credit would have been given.
So if it's authored by one doctor, would it be fair that that article's probably been written by them and not checked by anyone else?
Probably.
But if it's written by perhaps an executive committee member, but credit is given to these number of doctors, it's probably that there's been an input from those doctors to form a consensus view.
I don't recall directly, but I think it's highly likely.
With that input from the clinicians in medical articles, was that primarily from the medical advisory panel?
No, not necessarily. They were quite often the first port of call, but again, there may well be clinicians who didn't happen to be on the medical advisory panel, who we knew to have a particular interest or expertise in a particular area. So it would pretty well always be a centre director of a haemophilia centre. Occasionally it might be a pure specialist, but it would always be at least a centre director.
In your statement, you're clear that the medical advisory panel was an advisory panel, and that the society would make its own policy and decision as it felt fit. Was that the position throughout your time on the executive committee, or did the society's interaction and approach with the panel change over time?
I draw a distinction between what I would call medical and scientific information, where we weren't competent to second guess the medical advisory panel, and issues relating, for example, to policy on some aspects of treatment. So, for example, in the 1990s, as what became known as high purity factor VIII products came in, and then in due course recombinant artificial products, which we use now, came in. we were much more aggressive in calling for their introduction than the medical advisory panel or the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation were. So one might see, as I say, a slight disconnect in an area like that. But as far as sort of in scientific terms, then, you know, we weren't in a position to, as I say, second guess them.
We're going to come on to the review of the medical advisory panel that took place in 1991 in just a moment. But in relation to the period before 1991, I think you've said that you had no direct dealings with the panel at all during your tenure.
Not officially. I knew some of them personally or acquaintances with them, but not officially. Relationships were usually between the chairman or the general secretary or the staff particularly. So either David Waters or in due course Graham Barker. They would have had the direct contact with them.
So can you help us with this? If the executive committee felt they needed advice on a particular issue, how did that reach the medical advisory panel?
That would be delegated to probably David Waters or Graham Barker, who was the policy manager, and they would seek advice from the medical advisory panel.
And then how was the advice conveyed back to the committee? Did you ever get anything in writing from the clinicians, or was
yes.
it primarily verbal?
Primarily, again, it varied enormously depending on the nature. So, again, I'm sure we'll cover it, but you know, we would get feedback at executive meetings or policy group meetings or whatever, but it would probably be mostly verbal.
I'd just like to unpick a little bit more about the clinical information that was in some of the Society's publications. And you've addressed the situation for patients in some detail in your witness statement. Could we put that up on the screen so everyone can see what we're looking at? It's WITN 45401. And it's paragraph 22 and 23 to start with. Page 5, presuming. Here, in paragraph 21, you've talked about responding to the HIV impact on the haemophilia community created a huge range of tasks. And then paragraph 22 and 23, initially, the most urgent need from the community was for information on the threat and support and advocacy in responding to it. 23, reliable information was difficult to obtain, both because it was a new and emerging threat about which little was known, but also in the early days there'd been differences in opinions by clinicians as to the impact on people with haemophilia. Could you expand on that for us, please? You say there were differences in opinion. What are you addressing there?
I think it's an issue which I think the inquiries looked at previously, in that there were, and this is slightly in retrospect because as I say, I wasn't around in 1983, 84, round about that period, but there was, appeared to me to have been a difference of opinion between some clinicians as to whether or not HIV was a serious threat to people with haemophilia, or whether it was something that was going to be confined to the gay and drug use community. And also there were issues about whether or not there were, because of the high level of treatment that we'd had, whether that was going to impact it. So there was, it was my perception that there had been some differences of opinion.
And was that perception formed when you joined the society more substantially in 1985-86, or is this a hindsight reflection?
I think it was, I think it was around about that time, because there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of uncertainty around the whole issue of HIV. There was uncertainty about its elements of its transmission, and I just remember that there was a lot of areas of uncertainty. I can't remember detail.
And were there discussions then within the executive committee meeting, or perhaps as the side conversations over coffee afterwards, about those difficulties?
Not particularly. I think the issue that really I'm referring to there is actually probably in the earlier paragraph 22. Was core information about how dealing with HIV, and that was the key issue. So people needed to know, where other family members at risk. There was a whole area about, as I say, transmission, and it was those areas particularly, I think, that we were concentrating on.
Were you aware of any discussions that reflected back on the advice that the society had given in 83?
No.
This was primarily about what was happening in 85?
Yes.
You also say here that reliable information was difficult to obtain. Can you give us anything more specific on what you're dealing with here?
Again, this is just dealing with HIV specifically as an issue. I can't recall exactly, even though I was later very involved in Terence Higgins Trust, when that started up. I think it was 94, 95, but again, they only had one member of staff. There was a real shortage of information from reliable sources, and indeed, as a result of that, I haven't mentioned it, but I and others from Terence Higgins Trust sought to set up the National AIDS Trust to provide an authoritative source of information. There was information from doctors, but there was no, at that point, very many organisations who were saying, you don't have to worry about sharing a seat with somebody who's got HIV. You don't have to worry about being in the same room as them. You don't, and we were dealing with a whole range of issues, which, again, clearing the evidence of children being discriminated against at school, of people who, were not getting medical treatment because of their HIV status, and that was the focus of our activities around about that time, was trying to redress and deal with situations like that.
I don't want to put words in your mouth,
No,
but
sure.
it sounds like you're describing quite a vacuum of information.
Yes, there was a huge vacuum.
And paragraph 25 of your statement indicates that, from your perspective, the response to these issues was a need for regular and rapid communication of information.
Yes.
From a trusted and independent source.
Yes.
So would it be fair to suggest that the society was seeking to fill that
Yes.
vacuum with information?
Yes.
And would it also be fair, therefore, to suggest that by filling that vacuum, that they were anticipating that people would rely on the information they were being provided with?
You give people information, it's for them to deal with it, but we hope they would, particularly, as I say, in response to HIV at that point.
And how much of this information that you were providing was coming from the medical advisory panel, was coming from clinicians?
It would all have been coming from clinicians. We would have been sort of interpreting it and turning it into lay language which was accessible to people. So I mentioned there, for example, Dr. Peter Jones, who played a leading role in supporting us at that point, and the publication that he is referred to there, AIDS in the Blood, was a very important document which, in lay terms, but in the context of haemophilia, was made available to members so that they could understand, as we knew it in 1985, what having HIV meant for them.
And in paragraph 23, you've spoken of there being differences in opinion by clinicians. How did the society deal with those differences of opinion? Was it a situation where the society had to try and decide what the consensus was likely to be, or
I think by 1995-96 there was
85, 86,
sorry,
I
85.
think
Thank you. 85, 86. You know, there was less difference of opinion as information on HIV became more and more widespread. There was the first AIDS conference. This became a topic at World Federation of Hemophilia conferences, and so whilst my recollection is that, for example, before 1985, then there were various disparate thoughts going around from about that period onwards, and certainly the period when I was a trustee, there was much more of a solid consensus on issues relating to HIV and haemophilia.
And when you became a trustee in 1986 and you'd been co-opted in 85, was there any reflection or discussion about the different opinions that had been in existence before your time?
Not that I'm aware of. It might be worth pointing out that most of the trustees at that time had themselves HIV, and so they would have been thinking about their own situation, but I'm not aware of any formal discussions or even informal discussions.
Shumik, could we have HSOC 0010470, please? That's a different document to my reference. If I could just have a moment. I'm sorry, Shumik, my fault. HSOC 0010277. Thank you. We're picking up a document in relation to the Medical Advisory Panel review in 1991, and paragraphs 2 and 3 are what I want to look at. The starting point for this review was the concern felt by society representatives attending MAP that some of the meetings were not a productive use of their time. There was a feeling that on occasions both the medical and society members of the panel felt disappointed with the substantive outcomes from the meeting. This raised the question as to whether there was possibly no need to have regular meetings or even a panel at all. It was felt that it was sometimes difficult for members of MAP to take off their centre directors' hats and give independent advice. Then para 3, it was agreed that the Society needs advice and information on the latest medical and scientific developments in the fields of both treatment and research. This advice is needed on both an informal and formal level. Informal advice is helpful in formulating policy and in developing information and advice for members. Given on an informal basis, that advice is likely to be more independent and less likely to reflect a possibly false consensus view of the Centre Directors organisation. Now, before I ask you in detail about that document, you've actually already addressed it. You've already addressed it in your witness statement, and again, it may be useful to have the paragraph on the screen so we can all see it. It's paragraph 71 of the statement, WITN 45401. WITN, page number 14. Paragraph 71. You've said here, there was a belief by the Society that it desperately needed independent, unbiased, expert medical and scientific advice on the huge issues facing the society. Conversely, there was a belief amongst members of the MAP that it saw itself as representing their haemophilia centres to the society. Consequently, issues such as the cost of new products, concerns about potential liability and legal actions, and the innate conservatism of many clinicians mitigated against them giving honest, independent advice to the society. There was a view that they tended to cover their backs by taking an overly conservative view of emerging threats, prioritising issues such as costs and funding, and avoiding breaking the consensus view of their peers. Was that a reflection of the particular concerns in 1991, or was it a reflection of concerns that had been ongoing over a period of time?
It was ongoing over a period of time, and I noted from the date of the earlier document that I probably wasn't actually a trustee at that point. However, I think that there was certainly a sort of conflation between the role of the Medical Advisory Panel and the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation. And I think that, as I say in my statement, that we weren't necessarily convinced that we were getting from MAP as a body necessarily the most helpful information. We would get it usually from an individual who might be a member of the Medical Advisory Panel, but I think as a group it wasn't at that point, I think, terribly good at sort of coming to a consensus views, and I think they were influenced by other factors, which was one of the reasons why we had the review at that point, and we changed the structure to some extent of the Medical Advisory Panel, and I think made a clearer distinction between the HCDO as the centre directors running haemophilia centres and the medical panel.
You've talked about the society desperately needing independent advice. Was it the sense of the society that prior to 1991 they hadn't received truly independent advice?
I think my use of the word independent is outside the executive committee.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, we needed advice from people who were not trustees of the society.
So you're discussing here that the medical advisory panel.
Yes.
And are you suggesting, or were you meaning to say that the society, that the executive committee hadn't received independent advice from the medical advisory panel, that the medical advisory panel hadn't given truly independent advice?
Well, I think that, as I say there, that they, in the context of a medical advisory panel, I think they tended to, as I say, quite often take a conservative position if they wanted to try and get a consensus. As I say, we tended to get, I think, better information by talking to people on an individual basis, where they weren't having their peers peering, dare I say, over their shoulders.
And was that a reflection? Sorry, I should go back to the question, but was that a reflection of the situation going all the way back through to the late 70s, early 80s?
I don't know, but it was I think there are two things. I think also the evidence, the documents I've seen shown that there was remarkably little turnover in the medical advisory panel, that the people who tended to be on there had been on there for a very long time, which I think was probably unhealthy. But I can't comment on what it was earlier, but that's definitely a sense I got from sitting on the executive committee.
And that was not just your view, but the view of the whole committee?
Yes.
Your statement goes a little further than just that it wasn't independent, but that it wasn't honest, independent advice. Can you unpack that for us? What were you particularly thinking there?
I think, again, as I say later on in that paragraph, I think there was a tendency to tone down their advice, or rather than necessarily tell us everything that they thought. That was a sense I had. I can't prove it, but it was the sense that I had, and I think other members of the executive had, and we would sometimes, as I say, outside an MAP meeting, not that I was directly involved in those meetings, but talking to a clinician separately or independently, one might get a slightly more forceful view or a more detailed view. So I think that's my interpretation.
And final point on this paragraph, Mr. Taylor, you also talk about them covering their backs. Again, that's quite striking language. What were you meaning by that? What were they covering their backs in relation to?
I can't remember specifically, but my sense was, as I say there, that they took a more conservative view. You know, I think it's and you know, they avoided trying to break a consensus. So I think they were, you know, they would take the sort of a slightly more lower common denominator approach to things.
Just on that, if I may, an overly conservative view of emerging threats mightn't, on the face of it, be covering one's back. One might have thought that taking any emerging threat seriously might be the way to cover
Indeed.
one's back. So, by talking about covering one's back, you're not really speaking here, are you, given your last answer, of having a conservative view of emerging threats so much as worried about breaking ranks? Is that the point?
Well, I think, again, there would be a wide range of issues, so the application of this would vary by situation to situation. So, but for example, in 1991, you know, hepatitis was becoming an emerging threat and becoming an emerging issue, which it had not. And it might have been that, and I'm sure we'll cover this in due course, that they took a more conservative view than might have been warranted. So, but I think you couldn't apply these comments necessarily to every single situation that we were dealing with the MAP. It would have varied, but I'm reflecting there a sense that I think I and other members of the executive had.
Yes, it was really just the combination of covering their backs by doing something. I can understand covering backs and taking an overly conservative view, but
maybe I was a little sloppy in my writing.
No, it's your writing. So I'm just trying to understand it.
I think it was, as I say, I think it was. We had a number of different things going on at the same time. So in some cases, they would not want to break the consensus view. In other cases, they might take a more conservative approach than we would take, because we would feel on the front line of emerging threats, and you know, it's possible we would come out of an interaction with them thinking, well, are they taking this seriously enough? And sometimes being conservative is a way of, you know, not raising your head above the parapet and as I say, taking the easy approach. I don't know if that helps.
No, that's quite helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to move on now to the HIV campaign.
Mm-hmm.
What was the Society campaigning for when you joined in 1985? What status was the campaign at the point that you joined?
There wasn't really a campaign when I joined, and indeed, one of the reasons I joined was particularly for that very reason. You know, professionally, my professional experience was in communications, public relations, political lobbying, and one of the reasons I came forward was because I felt that could be helpful to the society. And I think at that point, there wasn't really. It was still a question of coming to terms with this awful, dreadful thing that had happened, and so it was probably opportune time for me to get involved to help start campaigning.
And just in terms of how you got involved, did someone come and talk to you and say, look, we'd love to have you, or was there something in the bulletin that you looked at and thought, gosh, I could be really helpful? As an ordinary member, how did you make that transition onto the committee?
I got in touch with the General Secretary, David Waters, and said, hello, here I am, because I hadn't had any interaction with them. I didn't know them. They didn't know me particularly or know that I existed. And so I made myself known to them and said, can I help?
So how would other members of the society have been able to influence what the campaign would be or how the campaign would be run? Was there any opportunity for members to shape it?
Yes. There were interactions. So, for example, the annual meeting, council meetings, which were held, I believe, if I recall, twice a year, which was when sort of ordinary members, if we could use that term, and representatives of groups would meet with the executive committee. So they'd have an opportunity at that point. But I think also an awful lot of members were in touch with the society on a sort of through correspondence and telephone calls, apart from asking for information and help. I think they would have been saying, we need to do something about this.
You also say in your statement that the committee was informed by political, legal and the medical advice given on a personal basis, i.e. outside the formal structure of the MAP, the Medical Advisory Panel, in relation to the campaign. What medical advice did the committee receive in relation to the campaign?
I particularly thinking there again of the work that Peter Jones did in producing supporting materials that were used in the campaign, and again there are documents in the evidence of what the impact was on people with haemophilia, so which we could then use with opinion formers, the media, politicians, people like that.
Did clinicians have any role in saying what the society should campaign
No.
for? Could we turn to HSOC 0023211, please, Shumik? We have here an agency brief that you wrote together with David Waters in February 1987. And if we turn to page 2, we can see under the heading Legal Remedy, where it said a limited number of legal actions have been started in the United States against commercial manufacturers of blood products. Those cases are not supported by the National Haemophilia Foundation, the US equivalent of the UK Haemophilia Society, as it's envisaged that this could bring about problems with the supply of concentrates in the United States. Indeed, the concern is that the manufacturers might withdraw from the production altogether. While it's the case that in the UK the Central Blood Laboratories Authority produce a considerable amount of concentrates under the National Health Service, this amounts to only currently 22% of the UK requirement. Was that concern about supply of concentrates something that was discussed at the Executive Committee in 1987 in relation to whether legal action should be pursued?
I don't recall. No, I don't recall.
And in the next paragraph, there's reference to council's opinion having been taken on in relation to whether action could be taken on behalf of all people with haemophilia who are HIV antibody positive. And the indication is that those actions could not succeed in the majority of cases and that a class action wouldn't be possible. Again, why was this put into an agency brief for the campaign? Why is this put in such a central part of it?
Well, this was a brief to potential public relations or lobbying agencies to help with the campaign, and it was important that, as one aspect of that campaign, first question which an agency might have asked would have been, well, what about legal action? And so it was important to explain our understanding at the time of where we were with legal action, and the whole question of litigation over this period obviously became a key issue, and so it was important to brief them on what we understood to be the background, and therefore why a political campaign focusing on the moral argument would probably be more important and was required rather than just relying on litigation.
The two paragraphs we've just looked at make it clear that the society's had council's opinion that's negative, but was it also part of the society's thinking that they didn't want to encourage litigation because they were concerned about the supply of blood products?
I don't recall that at all. I think no, I don't recall that.
The campaign got started in the spring of 1987, and then there was some delay because of the general election. But in the October of 1987, a submission was put together by the society, wasn't it, that went to the government. Could we look at that? HSOC 000 3459, please. And my understanding is that you were quite heavily involved in preparing this submission,
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
If we turn to the first substantial page, the second page of the PDF, we can see the heading Summary. And in the fourth paragraph down, we see that it's written that at government's suggestion, the society has already explored the question of redress through the legal system. Can you tell us about who in government had suggested that the society should explore legal redress?
Every civil servant and every minister that we spoke to. So, for example, and I think I cite, this was repeatedly, if this was raised in Parliament, the ministerial replies would always be compensation is a matter for the courts.
The paragraph then goes on to say that the society has been advised that claims for compensation as such are most unlikely to succeed because of the difficulty of proving negligence, and in any case the society is advised that any solution which may be provided by the courts will not be available in the short term, however the needs of families are immediate. What was the thinking behind putting in a submission to the government the fact that the society had received negative legal advice?
Because we needed to make it absolutely clear that legal advice, the government's position that we should pursue a litigation approach, frankly, was an abdication of their responsibilities, and it was to some extent, a sort of get out of jail card, because they knew very well that people were dying, and that by the time the litigation was complete, there would be many, many deaths, and that wasn't going to be an appropriate solution. So it was important for us to say to the government, what you are suggesting is not reasonable or realistic in providing support to people who urgently need it now.
It could be suggested that by telling the government we don't have a legal case, that the legal advice is negative, that was strengthening their hand in any negotiations because there wasn't the threat of litigation behind it. What would your response to that be? Was that something you discussed and thought about?
I don't recall specifically whether or not we discussed it, but I would say it was really important because they wanted us to go to court because they knew that it would take years, it would be very difficult to prove, and we had to say that, as I say, they were being disingenuous in suggesting this, and we had to say it, this was not a submission just to government, this was a submission and a briefing to politicians of all parties. And in order to build a consensus, a coalition rather, of support, it was important to say, the government have said this is the route we should go down. It's a false route, and that we need help now, and there is a political and moral argument that they should meet.
There were some members of society who were litigating.
Absolutely.
Was there any consideration given to whether this would undermine their position in the litigation?
I think the view was that it wouldn't really make any difference because the law would be what the law was. This was a political campaign, and as became clear after 1987, the two ran in parallel effectively. So we had the litigation actions taking place, but we also had the political media and moral campaign going on at the same time. So we were effectively attacking from both sides.
And this was in October 1987.
Yes.
It was really quite a short campaign in the autumn.
Yes.
Because on the 16th of November 1987, as we know, the fund of £10 million was announced.
Indeed.
After the money was announced to set up what became the Macfarlane Trust, you've described that there was then to be a second stage of campaigning for further monies. Is that right?
Yes.
Could we turn to HCDO 40276 HCDO 40276 _043, please, Shumik. We can see the headline of the bulletin. It's the fourth bulletin of 1987. It's a start. And as we go through the article, we can see that there's 3 points that are made. Firstly, the justice of the society's call for recompense has been acknowledged. And then further down the next paragraph, secondly, the allocation of £10 million from the Treasury to meet some of the financial needs of those affected is a timely, flexible and compassionate gesture from the government. And then the next paragraph, thirdly, the fact that the fund has been given into the control of the Haemophilia Society to administer is a tribute to the esteem in which the society is held by the public and the government. The article carries on to the final page of the bulletin, which we don't particularly need to go to. But there's nothing in the article that sets out what will happen next with the campaign at this point.
No.
Had there been any discussions at that stage of what would...
Not that, we're talking about a really short period of time. We're talking about, a few weeks. and our focus was very much on, how do we now respond? I think that a few months later, then we started thinking about the next stage.
Let's look at that together. HSAC.
Sorry, could I just add?
Of course.
The phrase "it's a start" implied that from day one we recognised that this was going to be insufficient, and it was a totally insufficient and inadequate amount of money, but it was a foot in the door. It was a recognition of the moral case that we had put, and that we would be back for more.
And that's what I want to pick up with you next,
Okay.
Mr. Taylor. If we can turn to HSAC 0019910. It's dated the 14th of December 1987, so very quickly after the announcement. It's the Haemophilia 17, the campaign continues. And if we go to the last page of the document, page 4, I think, that's it, we can see the 3 points that the campaign is going to be focused on: the continuing need for a special weekly benefit, the need to speed up DHSS procedures for dealing with claims for attendance allowance and other social security benefits, and thirdly, the importance of provision for life insurance and mortgage protection. And then the note, and in future, the government has left the door open for us to approach them if it becomes apparent that our needs have not been met. We're confident that in further representations to the Secretary of State, we shall receive the same consideration as at our earlier meeting. Is it fair to say that at this point in time, the Society was not immediately saying we need more money, but that the understanding was that if it was needed, then it would be forthcoming?
It wasn't guaranteed, and we didn't really know. I think we might have been seeking to put words in the minister's mouth, shall we say, by saying that they would come back with more, and the campaign and the requirements of the campaign developed a bit more over time as we had more time. But as I say, in November and December of 1987, we were sort of overwhelmed with an awful lot of logistical issues, just dealing with literally. I remember the General Secretary receiving a cheque and thinking, what do I do with a cheque for £10 million? So it was quite nuts and boltsy at that stage, as well as dealing with our members who were saying, well, when am I going to get my money, kind of thing. So it developed, but we weren't, whilst we hoped very much that we would get more money, and I'm sure we'll talk about the McFarlane Trust maybe later, that wasn't clear until actually 2 years later, I believe, where they did say, yes, there will be some more money, first of all, for the McFarlane Trust, and we then went on to discuss and call for more substantial payments, which came through in due course.
The wording on this document that we're looking at suggests that there's been some indication from the government that there would be more money. Is that not quite what was happening, or is this an accurate representation of the discussions you were having?
Well, I wasn't directly involved in the discussions, and I hadn't been involved in the discussion with the Secretary of State, so I wasn't in a position to say that. But I think we were expressing, as I say, a strong hope, and we were expressing we might have been putting an interpretation on it, as I say, partly to put more pressure on the government, to say, you have said in the future, to say, you have said that, there might be more money available.
As you say, you were a trustee of the McFarlane Trust from 1988 to 1990.
Mm-hmm.
And in your statement, you've said you felt you had to balance the desire to be generous with the need to preserve the capital of the fund.
Yes.
Why did you consider that the capital of the fund had to be preserved?
Because we hadn't had a firm assurance that more money would be made available, and that wasn't made available. That wasn't made, I believe, until a meeting, as I say, I think 2 years later, where the government said, yes, we will provide additional funds. So we had to take, to some extent, a precautionary approach with the capital.
But by taking a precautionary approach, did that not perhaps mean that the government wouldn't realise that there was greater need? Was there any discussion about that?
No. Well, I think again, we had to make the balance, as I think I said, between being sort of showing the government that we were being responsible custodians and therefore worthy of more money, whilst at the same time the society keeping the political pressure up that additional funds should be made available.
In your statement, you've described that the Macfarlane Trust was independent of the government. However, the Macfarlane Trust was mindful to ensure that the government was content in the way the trust was being operated, particularly in order to be in a good position to seek additional funding for the ongoing work of the trust. Would you say that the trust by and large saw itself as implementing decisions of the Department of Health, or were they independent of it?
Then we were independent. We made our own decisions. But as I say, we weren't certain at that point, for the first year or two, whether additional funding would be made available. And so we, as I say, had to balance generosity with if we don't get any more money, then we need to make sure that there is funds ongoing for some considerable time. We couldn't guarantee it until, as I say, that other meeting in 1989, where I believe the minister agreed that there would be additional funding. That changed the situation for the Macfarlane Trust, and we then realised that additional regular funding would probably become available, and that could change the situation and the way that the trust worked.
In seeking to ensure that the government was content with how the trust was operating, was the trust then constrained in what it did?
I wouldn't say that, but it was important that we were being seen to act responsibly, with proper procedures. That kind of thing is really what I think we're getting at.
And did it impact on that decision about how generous the trust could be?
Well, we could have just given away all the money, but if we, as I say, without a guarantee of additional funds, then that would not necessarily have been in the best interests of the beneficiaries if we'd sort of blown the cash, as it were.
You spoke a moment ago about the Macfarlane Trust administering the money,
yes,
and the society putting the pressure on the government to increase the funding. In relation to the society, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think they did enough to press for more financial support in relation to the Macfarlane Trust?
I would think yes, because the money came. We got the money, which is the bottom line.
Do you think they could have done more to get it more quickly?
Political campaigns are uncertain. I think that a 2-year period, government wasn't going to, I don't think the government was going to come back more quickly than, as I say, a 2-year period. They've said, well, we've given you £10 million. get on with that, as it were. So I think it would have been highly unlikely that the government would have moved more quickly, regardless of what the society or anybody else had done.
I just want to explore one further aspect in relation to the society. Could you turn with me to, Shumik, could we have HCDO 40279_004, please? And I'd like to just go to page 2, please. This is a bulletin, the first bulletin of 1989, and we can see in the first 2 paragraphs, it says the editorial board has recently been considering the extent to which matters relating to HIV and AIDS should feature in the bulletin and update. Some readers have suggested that these topics receive too much attention in these pages. Since the advent of AIDS, the Haemophilia Society as a whole has made strenuous efforts to maintain a one society approach for people with haemophilia, with and without HIV. And it goes on to discuss what they're going to do about publications. First of all, can you tell us how the society came to hear those comments from members? How was that? How's the society aware of those different concerns?
I would guess that would have been through telephone calls, correspondence to the office, and to the officers. So that would have been to the chairman and to David Waters, people. There were a lot of people, a lot of our members, who either because they were not directly affected by HIV, or indeed, if they were affected, found the coverage in the Society's publications what we would now call triggering, and felt that, as I say, as the editorial says, that we were placing too much emphasis on it. I think it was particularly true of cases of, we had a lot of, the Society particularly has always catered for families with young children with haemophilia. And because of the nature of the condition, if you have a child with haemophilia, particularly if it's not been in the family, then the family want help and support. And so I think there was a feeling that lots of talk about HIV and things like that was not necessarily family friendly. But as I say, there was some pushback, but we felt that we should keep the balance, and we had a duty to cover these sorts of issues.
This is obviously talking about the publications.
Yes.
Had there also been some pushback about the campaign that had been run?
Yes, indeed, and there were, elements of the membership who felt that the whole high profile or the connection that haemophilia had with HIV was unhelpful, because, again, as I've said elsewhere in my statement, haemophilia became, in the public perception, a marker for having HIV or AIDS. And so people who had haemophilia were finding themselves subject to discrimination and stigma just for having haemophilia, let alone having HIV or AIDS. And so there were quite a few people who felt that they didn't want that high profile. And this happened again in years to come over hepatitis as well. They wanted to just quietly get on with their lives of having haemophilia.
That's one side of the spectrum. Were there others at the other end of the spectrum who were seeking greater campaigning work from the Society in relation to HIV? We'll come to hepatitis later.
Yes, and we had that constant balancing act between people with HIV who felt that we should be doing much more, and people who did not have HIV who felt that we were already doing too much. And as trustees, we had to balance those, and one never completely succeeds.
So I'm about to move on to a different topic, and I see the time. I wonder whether now's a good time to take the morning break.
Yes, it is. We'll take a break until 11:45. Now, Mr. Waters, you may be watching previous sessions. You will know that on each occasion that there's a break, a first break anyway, I advise a witness that at any break they must not discuss the evidence they have given or may yet be asked to give, whatever else they wish to talk about.
Indeed. Thank you.
11:45.